So Sonia Schoenfield is a retired librarian who worked at Cook Library for 36 years, and we miss her desperately. While there, she and fellow librarian Arlene Lane started the genealogy and local history departments at the library. Sonia has been a volunteer with the Libertyville Historical Society for many years and has been fascinated by the Wide Awakes banner in the Cook House and its story. She has previously spoken about the Wide Awakes for the Historical Society, the Lake County History Symposium, and the Rock River Valley Civil War Roundtable. Sonia lives in Mundelein with her husband and 2 cats. She has 2 children who are well on their way to adulting. And welcome, Sonia. Jenny, thank you for that kind welcome. I am extremely happy to be here tonight to introduce you to the Wide Awakes, an organization that is one of history's best kept secrets. And I'd also like to show how our historical society is connected to them. I might have to change my wording, though, to say that the Wide Awakes were one of history's best kept secrets. Recently, timed perfectly for this talk and our fundraising efforts, a new book came out called Wide Awake, The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War by John Greenspan, who is the curator of political history at the Smithsonian. This is on your handout. I know the library has copies, but you might want to get a copy of your own and mark it up because it's just fascinating. If you are all interested in the Wide Awakes, this is the book for you. I learned about the Wide Awakes in the Historical Society from the Ansel B. Cook Home and Museum in Libertyville here. In the upstairs hallway, if you haven't seen it, is a framed black silk banner with the emblazoned words presented to the Wide Awakes of Libertyville by the Chicago Wide Awakes on October 2nd, 1860. You can sort of see the size of it in the picture on the right with me. That's half of the banner. It's about 6 feet high with gold painting. Personally, I think it's stunning. This picture neither picture does it justice. You have to see it in person. Anyway, when I first saw it, this banner really intrigued me. So I did some reading and research like a good librarian does, and discovered that the Wide Awakes were not just a Libertyville group or even a Chicago area group. I found out that they were in many other towns and states besides Illinois, and my research shed a lot of light on who the Wide Awakes were. As Jenny mentioned, I was able to share my research at a couple of talks I gave about 10 years ago. And then I read Greenspan's book when it came out, which validated a lot of my original research and, of course, went much deeper into who the Wide Awakes were. So I'm thrilled to share my updated presentation with you tonight, and I hope that you'll enjoy hearing about this little known, but according to Greenspan, highly influential 1860s group. So if you ask the man on the street who the Wide Awakes were, you'd probably get a blank look or some vague answer about sleeping. I don't know. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer this question with gusto. Let's start off by getting a visual of what this group looked like, and then we'll find out where they came from and what they were all about. So here's a picture of a typical Wide Awake, proudly posing for his portrait. Notice the torch that he's holding, which was a common feature, and also the cape and the cap that he's wearing. In a nutshell, the Wide Awakes were young men who enthusiastically supported Lincoln and the Republican Party in the state and presidential elections of 1860. Some were so young that they couldn't even vote yet. Most of them were probably not married, with plenty of time to meet in the evenings to practice their marching drills and participate in parades. Most clubs met several times a week to practice. Now, this Wide Awake looks a little bit older to me. Notice that his cape has a white ribbon on it. So they would address or add things to their uniforms as they saw fit. Another important feature of the wide awakes I touched on was their torches. They carried torches filled with kerosene and lit them on fire. Then they marched with them in parades and processions at night. You can imagine what a sight that would have been. Most of the early torches were homemade, so you'll see different kinds. Of course, the wide awakes also marched during the day, so some torches like these had slogans. The one on the left says, Abraham the Faithful and Hannibal the Brave. And the one on the right just says wide awake. Here's a good picture of a torch that swiveled with the wick ready to be lit to light the kerosene in the bulb below. And this is one of the torches that you'll see when you go into the cookhouse and museum in Libertyville. It belongs to the Historical Society and is a fairly unusual design, but it's very popular with the kids because of the connection with the Captain America logo. This torch is on display in the Civil War Museum in Kenosha. So if you ever go up to that museum, look for their wide awakes display there. The officers of the clubs carried torches and lanterns, instead of torches. Most of the time, captains carried red lanterns and lieutenants carried blue and green. Also in their parades and processions, besides carrying torches, the wide awakes carried banners in support of Lincoln and Hamlin. Some of the banners had the wide awakes name on them, like these here. And some banners focused more on the issues of the campaign. But you can still see that not so subtle wide awake eye emblem here. Banners like these were often handmade by the ladies of the town to support their wide awake club. Another type of banner that the wide awakes carried was called a transparency, which was a box covered with a cloth that had a campaign slogan printed on it on the outside, and inside was a torch or light of some sort that would illuminate the box from the inside. This transparency spells out the issues of the campaign pretty well. And this is what it looked like on the other side. It was carried by the Chatham, New York wide awakes. You can see the scale of how big it was and how it kind of would work from this museum picture here. As I mentioned a minute ago, the wide awakes marched in parades and processions. Often they were silent when they marched. They just marched in lockstep order with their torches and didn't say anything. But some groups had their own bands, which added to the excitement, I think. In some cases, the band might have played this wide awake quick step that was written for them, a lively marching tune. As the campaign wore on, the parades often had displays of fireworks and rockets, just in case the people weren't worked up enough already. One of the most often mentioned formations that the wide awakes marched in was called the zigzag formation, which reflected the zigzag pattern of the split rail fences that Lincoln was known for making. This is from a wide awake marching booklet that was published to help clubs across the country learn the songs and marches that were used by other wide awake clubs. And this illustration gives you an idea of what that zigzag formation looked like in action. Note the torches and the lantern. Now, from my description of the wide awake so far, you might have gotten a picture of a large, well-organized institution that spanned the country, but that's not quite true. I would say that it was more of a grassroots organization, which spread randomly across the country and flourished, especially in its early days, where the Republican Party was up against strong Democratic competition. John Greenspan, the man who literally wrote the book on the wide awakes, calls them a franchise. The beginnings of the wide awakes is an interesting story. So to fully understand where these wide awakes came from and to see how they grew into a national force, of course, we have to go back a little bit to the presidential election of 1856. There are three elements from that election that are relevant to the wide awakes of 1860. The 1856 election was the first presidential election that the Republican Party participated in. The candidate for the newly formed Republican Party was John Fremont. Uniformed torchlight clubs paraded in large numbers in support of Fremont. So torchlight processions were not new. They'd been around for a few years, at least before 1860. And there was a man in Hartford, Connecticut named George Bissell, who made a name for himself as an enthusiastic Republican and Fremont supporter. He was known for his old white hat that he would swing around and cheer energetically for Fremont. These are all going to come together, don't worry. Well, unfortunately for the Republicans, the Democrat Buchanan won the presidency in 1856, so the well-worn torches and the white hat were packed away for future use. Fast forward to the Connecticut gubernatorial election in March of 1860. The Honorable William Buckingham ran for governor for the Republicans against the well-known and popular Democrat Colonel Seymour of Hartford. But not everyone in Hartford was a Seymour fan. On Saturday evening, February 25th, 1860, the spring campaign was opened with a meeting in Hartford at which an immense audience was gathered to hear the Honorable Cassius Clay of Kentucky address the Republicans. The Hartford newspaper said that a torchlight procession had been arranged to escort Clay to his quarters. George P. Bissell, remember him, was acting as marshal, wearing his famous white hat of the Fremont campaign. The old torches were brought out for the procession, but many of them were leaked, said the newspaper. So 5 young textile clerks, in order to protect their clothing from dripping oil from these torches, cut squares of black cambric, sewn pieces of tape across the top to make improvised capes. So they wore those to protect themselves. One of the men who was there remembered Marshal Bissell, noticing those 5 young men, placed them at the head of the line where the novelty of their rig attracted much attention. And after the parade was over, they decided that a company be organized to wear glazed capes and caps and to provide better torches than those in use. Can't you just see it? I can picture those marchers getting together after the parade saying something like, "Hey, that was fun. We really made a good showing there. We should do that again." Their enthusiasm carried into the following days. Across the city of Hartford, members were recruited, a swinging torch was designed, and a meeting was called for Saturday, March 3rd, where 36 enthusiastic young men organized a marching club. They even had a cheer that went, "Hurrah, huzzah, hurrah, huzzah, hurrah, huzzah." I think it loses something in the translation. Probably like that rebel yell. I'd love to hear it in person. Anyway, here's some of the original 36, not all of them. And they were often called the original 36. They're pictured in all their uniformed and torch-bearing splendor. Well, they eventually made up certificates and wrote up a constitution. Here's their original broadside. They organized themselves with officers like president, vice president, recording secretary, but also along military lines with captains and aides. And at the very bottom, I don't know if you can see it, but one of the duties was a transparency bearer. So where did the Wide Awakes name come from? There are several theories about where the name came from. After a little research, I think the most likely origin is from an article in the Hartford newspaper on March 10th, the week after George Bissell and the young Hartford Republicans had escorted Cassius Clay and begun meeting to form their marching club. This article talks passionately about the issue between free and slave labor and the horrible consequences of a Democratic win, but takes hope in the fact that the Republicans are wide awake. Another possible source for the Wide Awake name comes from what I believe to be an apocryphal story involving Abraham Lincoln. Believe it or not, on March 5th, several days after Clay's speech in Hartford, Lincoln came to the same city to make his own Republican speech. And who was there to escort him? the wide awakes, which is depicted in this picture here, just as they had Cassius Clay. No doubt Lincoln was impressed with their showing. He's said to have remarked, "These Republicans are wide awake." Judge for yourself how the name came about. What is known is that the Hartford boys, at some point in one of their meetings, voted on the name Wide Awakes. And by March 24th, at least, when this article appeared in the Hartford paper, the torch-bearing candidate escorting marchers had become proclaimed as the Wide Awakes. Now, this article refers to a rally in Waterbury, Connecticut, where a bit of violence broke out among the Wide Awakes and the Democrats of Waterbury. As a side note, believe it or not, political gatherings around 1860 could get quite violent as words were exchanged and fighting broke out, with men throwing things like bricks, bottles, and worse. That's what the word loco-focoism refers to in that fourth line down. So there really was a need for escorts to protect the speakers at these rallies. Back to the Waterbury rally, notice the number of wide awakes. It says over 500 wide awakes were in the city. And this is barely a month after the first march in Hartford. All these wide awakes were coming to Waterbury from nearby towns. So from 5 to 500 in about a month. Well, the Republicans went to battle in the Connecticut elections in early 1860, and the wide awakes were right there with them, forming more and more clubs, whipping up enthusiasm in every parade, and escorting Republican speakers and candidates at the rallies. They also helped people get to the polls and were well versed in the issues at hand in order to persuade people to vote for the Republican candidate. When the ballots were counted in the Connecticut gubernatorial election, the Republicans came out on top. From this paper's perspective, at least, the victory was a sign that the state had averted a dreadful crisis and that the flag still waved free from treason. As the article continues, you can see where the credit was given for this victory. It says, "The wide awakes have been of great service to our cause by their exertions and discipline. They have enlisted for the war, and all will hereafter do effective service in the right cause." It's interesting to take note that the state elections were looked upon as a war, and the wide awakes had enlisted and were ready for battle. You'll see more of this conflict-related language with far-reaching consequences later in the presentation. These young men, intentionally or not, were beginning to make their mark on the political field. So word spread quickly, and Republican groups in other Eastern states began forming their own wide awake clubs. They would often write to the Hartford boys for advice on how to form their club. Interest was so great, and they received so many requests, that the Hartford Club produced a form letter to send to interested parties. A copy of the letter was actually reprinted in the Waukegan Weekly Gazette in July of 1860. So I know a letter was sent out here. The letter detailed how the wide awakes started and then explains their marches. It said, "We are drilled in a few simple military movements," and went on to outline their duties to help persuade voters to support the Republican ticket, including acting as distributors, checkers, challengers, and especially as patrolmen, bringing every Republican to the polls. In fact, this is still quoting from the newspaper, "In fact, wherever the fight is hottest, there is their post of duty, and there the wide awakes are found." As you can see, the wide awakes saw themselves, and others saw themselves, engaged in a battle for the hearts and votes of the people. And the battle was just beginning. So the Republicans were gathering momentum in the Northeast, and especially where the Democrats had looked strong, and wide awake clubs sprang up in cities throughout the eastern states. As the spring passed, attention turned from state elections to the national party conventions and who would be nominated for each party's candidate for president. We're just going to do a quick recap here of the 4 candidates in the 1860 election. First, Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat who believed passionately in states' rights or popular sovereignty. It was his insistence on keeping states' rights in the Democratic platform that ultimately split the Democratic Party. So when Douglas won the nomination for the Democrats at their second contentious party convention in Baltimore, furious Southern Democrats convened to nominate John C. Breckinridge, current vice president, as their candidate, the candidate of the Southern Democratic Party for president. The newly formed Constitutional Union Party, formed by members of the old Whig Party and the Know Nothing Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. And as you know, the Republicans nominated Lincoln over the popular William Henry Seward at their party convention in Chicago. I won't go into all the details concerning the Chicago Convention of 1860. That's way beyond our scope here. But because the Wide Awakes come back into the story at this point, we'll take a closer look at the Chicago Convention in early or mid-May of 1860 and how it impacted the popularity of the Wide Awakes. The Republican Party had chosen to meet in Chicago in May at the newly constructed Wigwam to put together their party platform and to choose a candidate for the presidential election. This event would be a watershed moment for the Wide Awakes, giving them national exposure and fanning the flames of republicanism. A month before the convention came to town, around April, the Chicago Tribune printed this article, which told the origins of the Wide Awake clubs from Connecticut and went on to urge the establishment of a Wide Awake club in Chicago. The young men, it said, of Chicago should organize themselves into a Wide Awake regiment. They dreamed of a spectacular torchlight procession marching into the wigwam with banners, music, and cheers that would generate enthusiasm for the Republicans' bid for the White House. Well, finally, the big day arrived, and the Wide Awakes were ready to play their parts. Here on May 15th, we read that they met the train from New York carrying William Seward and gave a fine performance, marching and counter-marching. I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds pretty spectacular. Wide Awake processions took place every evening during the convention, and I'm sure they made an impression on those who were there. Like many party conventions before and since, there was plenty of drama in Chicago that year. Suffice it to say that within a few days, the Republicans had their candidate, Abraham Lincoln, who beat out the heavy favorite, William Seward from New York. Soon, the other party's candidates would be chosen and the campaigning would begin in earnest, and the young Republican Wide Awakes men would be ready. The Republican convention brought the Wide Awakes into the spotlight, and soon clubs were forming all over the country. The Wide Awakes made such an impression in Chicago that I'm guessing every red-blooded young Republican male who was there wanted to get in on the action and returned home inspired to start a Wide Awake club of his own. Several factors contributed to the growth of the Wide Awakes at this point, in addition to their exposure at the convention. As we've already seen, newspapers were a natural means of announcing meetings and publicizing Wide Awake appearances. But not only that, they dictated the growth of Wide Awake clubs as well. Remember that Tribune article that said there should be a company of them in every considerable town in the Western states. The Telegraph helped the newspapers spread the word from one community to the other, and they also let newspapers reprint articles to kind of spread the word as well. Finally, the railroads also helped the movement gain strength, allowing the Wide Awakes to travel easily from one town to another to attend the political rallies there, and as well as each other's parades. Sometimes railroads offered discounted tickets to Wide Awakes going to a political rally. Here's another picture of a parade. I just love it. Wide Awake groups continued to form across the whole country. What young man who supported the ideals of the Republican Party wouldn't want to be part of a uniformed, disciplined, marching, torch-bearing group like the Wide Awakes? My research has found evidence of Wide Awakes all over the country, including Elmira, New York, Pittsburgh, Fond du Lac, Cleveland, and west of the Mississippi in Iowa, and even Waukegan, Illinois. This article from June 16, 1860, urges the formation of a Wide Awake club not only in Waukegan, but in each town in the country. Come, boys, it says the editor, stir yourselves, be up and doing. Here are the newspapers again, not only reporting the news, but making it as well. And if you'll remember, one of the Hartford boys sent a letter to Waukegan to get them started out here in Lake County. So it happened from Hartford, Connecticut to Waukegan, Illinois, and beyond. Now, as the popularity of the Wide Awake spread, there was a huge demand for uniforms and accessories. Here's an ad for a uniform set, complete with badges, torches and lanterns, capes and caps, all furnished to clubs on the most liberal terms, for Mr. C.M. Lee of Springfield, Massachusetts. Turns out that Mr. Lee's advertisement was quite successful. According to a later article I found, he had sold between 3,000 and 4,000 Wide Awake uniforms. And in fact, tailors could hardly keep up with the demand. Excuse me just a second while I get another. A good question would be to wonder what Lincoln thought of the Wide Awakes, this group that was taking the country by storm and cheering him on, contrasted by his hands-off approach to campaigning once he had been nominated. Surely he must have remembered seeing them back in March in Connecticut when he campaigned for the Republicans there. Then on August 8th in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln and the Wide Awakes met face to face. This is a picture of Springfield at the time. The Springfield Wide Awakes hosted a rally and invited Wide Awake companies from Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Missouri to attend. Pay attention to the dirt roads there. The Waukegan paper came down to Springfield and covered the event, and they claimed that 75,000 Republicans gathered in Springfield, including 4,000 Wide Awakes. Keep in mind that the population of Springfield at the time was only about 9,000. Lincoln watched as they paraded by his house in Springfield and proceeded to the state fairgrounds. At 5 o'clock, the paper reported, Lincoln went to the fairgrounds himself and addressed the crowds, including our Wide Awakes, by saying only, "It is my purpose, since I have been placed in my present position, to make no speeches." And that was it. So then Lincoln's carriage, as he tried to go back home, got stuck in the mud, which had been churned up by the thousands of Wide Awakes marching around. A group of German Wide Awakes from Chicago picked him up and put him on a horse that they led back to town. Here's a description from Greenspan's book of the event. In gratitude, Abe invited the Wide Awakes to come down to my house tonight, smiling that he wanted to shake hands with them. The Republican nominee greeted the Wide Awakes, who milled around outside his home, while lesser politicians speechified from 5 different bandstands. So Lincoln knew about these Wide Awakes. And here's a political cartoon that shows other people are connecting him with the Wide Awakes as well. He's here with his rail, his lantern, and cape and cap. You probably can't see the tiny writing there, but he's saying, "Aha, gentlemen, you needn't think to catch me napping, for I am a regular Wide Awake." As the popularity of the Wide Awakes grew, folks in the South couldn't help but take notice of them. Although the Wide Awakes were not formed as a military organization, they were often described as paramilitary because they had officers and they had marching drills, and let's face it, they did run into some violence. Here's a part of an article from Richmond, Virginia that was reprinted in the New York Times on September 29, 1860, entitled "Fear of the Wide Awakes at the South, idle apprehension. The Richmond paper wrote, "Not the least significant feature in the present canvass is the organization of Black Republican clubs in the northern states into military companies under command of marshals, captains, and sub-officers, some of whom have distinguished themselves in the Mexican War, and all of whom are selected with reference to superior qualifications as martial men. This organization or chain of organizations known as Wide Awakes are said to reach already 400,000 men." Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration and gross misinformation there. Surprise, surprise. But it shows that the South did indeed see the Wide Awakes as a threat. And even though the New York paper called it an idle apprehension, the South was truly worried about what those Wide Awakes might do. Here's an article from the Chicago Tribune published in June after the Republican convention, reporting on a Wide Awake group forming in Madison, Wisconsin. Within a week, they had 75 fully equipped and enthusiastic Republicans with lamps trimmed and burning. Listen to this wording: "We shall have an army of Wide Awakes ready for the final battle in November, and Wisconsin will do her whole duty." That was another phrase the Wide Awakes used a lot. Do your duty, Wide Awakes, do your duty. Early in the campaign, language like this was figurative and meant to get people excited. But as the campaign wore on, that figurative military images became more real, both to the southern states who would secede from the Union and the young men who would soon go off to fight real battles. As the campaign wore on, enthusiasm in the Republican ranks grew and grew. The Wide Awakes seemed to become more and more of a force to contend with. Lincoln's rivals in the election recognized the influence of the Wide Awakes in various ways. Stephen Douglas's followers claimed to form groups called the chloroformers, whose main purpose was to put the Wide Awakes to sleep. But these young men were not going to be caught napping in this campaign. Enthusiasm reached a fever pitch in October before the November election. The Wide Awakes of New York City decided to have a national Wide Awake demonstration a month before the election on October the 3rd. At first, Wide Awakes from New Jersey and Brooklyn were invited, but it soon became a much bigger event than that. This is New York, about 1860. So you can kind of get an idea of what it looked like. On the 3rd of October, Wide Awakes gathered in New York for one of, if not the biggest political rallies the city had ever seen. Newspaper accounts leading up to the day revealed plans of magnificent proportions. A grand arch was to be built across Broadway. Artillery companies would be present, along with decorated wagons. A buffalo from Kansas and an elk from Minnesota were also expected. Hotels were full up and the city was buzzing. This is one of the most famous illustrations of the Wide Awakes, and it depicts the New York Wide Awake demonstration. All the elements that we know about Wide Awakes are present. The capes and the caps, the torches, the banners, the crowd, all on a grand scale. Now, to give you an idea of the magnitude of this demonstration, the entire front page of the October 4th New York Times was dedicated to describing the event. And back then, it was 6 columns with no pictures. That was a lot of words. The streets were solidly paved. Here are some quotes from the paper. The streets were solidly paved with flaming torches. One reporter wrote that the smoke of so many torches forms a red canopy over the whole scene, and fresh discharges of grand fireworks take place. Roman candles, whizzing rockets, blazing blue lights, and effervescing rosy effulgences. There's probably some exaggeration there too, but I think it must have been pretty impressive. The Wide Awakes marched past some of New York's finest hotels like the Metropolitan and the Lafarge, pictured here. Just imagine all those torches reflecting off the windows and the rousing cheers. Meanwhile, out west in Chicago, Chicago had big plans of her own. This is Chicago in 1868, so, close to the time we're talking about. Coincidentally, the day before New York's National Wide Awake demonstration, William Seward, remember him, was scheduled to speak in Chicago on October 2nd. And that was reason enough for the wide awakes to flock to Chicago. William Seward, you may remember, had been the leading choice for president for the Republican Party at their convention back in May in Chicago. Despite losing to Lincoln, Seward took up the Republican banner and campaigned heavily for the Republicans and for Lincoln up until the November election. On October 2nd, he came back to Chicago. Here's an article from the September 15th Chicago Tribune calling all the wide awakes to be present at the reception of the Honorable William H. Seward at Chicago. You can see how the newspapers continued to play their part in these wide awake rallies. The second paragraph reads, "The Republican papers throughout the Northwest are requested to put this notice before their readers." So they did. This was printed in papers all over the place, including the Waukegan Weekly Gazette, where the notice was printed 2 weeks in a row on September 22nd and the 29th. Within a week, the papers were calling for more wide awake. The Tribune said that Chicago should have at least 2 more companies, one in the 10th Ward and one for the 8th and 9th. It said the young men of Chicago ought to parade 1,000 strong at the great torchlight procession of the 2nd of October. Interesting to note here that one of the companies listed is called the Lincoln Rangers. Their company rode horses. They claim to be the first mounted wide awake club in the country, which they might have been, but there was also a Warren Rangers group out of Warren Township as well. Now here's where the story comes home. In addition to the papers calling for more wide awakes, the Chicago wide awakes themselves helped galvanize attendance. Women associated with the Chicago group promised a beautiful banner to be presented to the Wide Awake Club, who had brought the greatest number of wide awakes in proportion to the number of Republican votes cast in their township, I think they meant, in 1858. The Waukegan paper was not going to let this challenge go unnoticed. On September 22nd, they described the prize banner being offered by the ladies of Chicago and asked, "Will Libertyville or Fremont or Wakanda or Waukegan bear off this prize? Let us all make the effort. It is not impossible that some town in Lake County may get it." Well, the big day arrived and people poured into Chicago. The Chicago Tribune wrote, "Never was our city visited in a single day by as many strangers. It surpassed in numbers even the attendance upon the National Convention last spring and the United States Fair of 1859. Every street swarmed and buzzed like a beehive, and they were there to hear the Honorable William Seward. Wide awakes came from Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Indiana, from towns like Michigan City, Indiana, Clinton, Iowa, Springfield, Mendota, Urbana, Union, Woodstock, Naperville, Milwaukee, Belvedere, Janesville, Rockford, Waukegan, and Libertyville. Seward made his speech from the speaker's stand on Market Street in front of Lynn's block, which is pictured here. He rode there in a carriage escorted by those Lincoln Rangers, the mounted wide awakes. Seward gave a rousing speech at 2 in the afternoon to a sea of people filling the 160-foot wide street just across Market Street from the Wigwam, the scene of the Republican convention that picked Lincoln over himself. That evening, the excitement continued as wide awakes who had come to hear Seward gathered on South Michigan Avenue for the torchlight procession up Clark Street. They marched past the Tremont House, pictured here, and other large buildings, which were all illuminated in support of Lincoln. At the end of the parade came another thrilling moment, the announcement of the winner of the prize banner. And the winner was Libertyville. of Lake County. Yeah, right. Their club brought 73 wide-awake men, which, when compared to the 63 Republican votes Libertyville cast in 1858, gave them the highest proportion to win the banner. Hurrah, huzzah! The banner was brought home by train and later displayed at the Lake County Fair in Libertyville just a few days later. These big rallies in New York and Chicago probably served to instill the wide awakes with great enthusiasm to return home and keep those fires of republicanism and Lincoln support burning bright until the election. I imagine that the month of October saw a great deal of torchlight processions from one end of the country to another, right up until the day before the election, including in towns across Lake County. The night before the presidential election, William Seward came to speak at the Palace Garden in New York City. The wide awakes did their duty and escorted him to the palace from his residence at the Astor House. They then went on to parade throughout the city from 14th Street to the Bowery and back again, probably a route similar to their October 3rd procession. You just couldn't get away from them. I think it's safe to say that there were other parades in other towns across the nation that night, with wide awakes getting their last hurrah, huzzah cheers in for Lincoln and doing their best to bring out the vote for him. This Chicago headline shows what part the wide awakes played on election day. They were urged to keep an eye on the voters and make sure that there was no tampering with the ballot boxes. I have no doubt that the wide awakes' vigilance on election day, coupled with their enthusiasm throughout the campaign season of 1860, contributed to Abraham Lincoln's victory in the 1860 election on November 3rd, 1860. You can be sure there were many more wide awake processions after November 6th, this time in celebration. The Waukegan Weekly Gazette printed the words to a song called For the Wide Awakes to be sung after the election. And a wide awake ball was planned in Waukegan for New Year's Eve. Yes, the wide awakes were a force to be taken seriously. Greenspan estimates that by August there were over 100,000 wide awakes across the country. Lincoln was elected and inaugurated. He was inaugurated the 16th President of the United States on March 4th, 1861. Now, you might think that the wide awakes would play a prominent part in the inauguration, or at least the inauguration parade, but in fact, they hardly had a presence in the parade at all. Many wide awakes came to Washington to see the inauguration, but they didn't parade with their torches and uniforms. The Springfield, Massachusetts newspaper reported there were large bodies of wide awakes who secured common quarters and were thoroughly organized, although they made no open or offensive demonstration of their presence. The only mention I could find about the wide awakes taking part in the inaugural parade was as part of the Republican Association's float, which was under charge of 10 wide awakes in full uniform, cape, cap, and all. The wide awakes had played their part in the campaign and the election, but once the election was over, newly elected President Lincoln's focus was on keeping the country together as much as possible. As we've seen, the wide awakes were kind of a divisive element between the North and the South. I suspect the wide awakes were asked not to participate in large numbers in full regalia out of concern that the South would find them offensive and antagonistic. Greenspan says it this way: Lincoln deftly handled wide awakes as a historic movement, a campaign club that had done valuable work, whose moment had passed. The men who joined the wide awakes in 1860 continued to cherish their memories of torchlight parades and electioneering as the years passed. Edwin Parkhurst, who was a member of the prize banner winning wide awake club from Libertyville, spoke so often during his life of his participation in the Chicago rally that it was in his obituary in 1927. I haven't done any research on men from Lake County wide awake clubs and their participation in the Civil War, but Mr. Grinspan's book includes an entire chapter titled, "I Would Rather Be a Soldier Than a Wide Awake." He estimates that around 3 out of 4 wide awakes made the leap from faux militarism to the real thing. The wide awakes did indeed continue to do their duty in the years following Lincoln's election. Years after the Civil War, the wide awakes made an appearance at the 1889 inauguration of Benjamin Harrison, who was reported to have been a wide awake himself. According to this article, they planned to carry a big blue banner that had been presented to them, to the Hartford men, by the Newark, New Jersey wide awakes. And the Hartford boys also carried this banner in Harrison's inauguration parade on March 4th, 1889. Interest in the wide awakes flared up again in Libertyville in 1960, the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's election and of Libertyville's winning that spectacular banner. The Historical Society gave a program on the wide awakes, complete with high school students singing wide awake songs. Boy, I wish I could have been there for that. Around the same time, there was a torchlight parade in 1960 in Mundelein from Hawley and Lake Streets to Lincoln School, and incumbent state Robert McClory was on hand to give a speech, and other party candidates showed up as well. And finally, believe it or not, wide awakes can still be found today. Here are a couple of pictures I found during my research of a reenactor as a wide awake and a Civil War buff wearing a wide awake t-shirt. I myself participated in a reenactment of a wide awake parade in Springfield in 2018 as part of Illinois' bicentennial celebration. To bring us back to the wide awakes of 1860, I propose that the wide awake clubs were more than a show of support for Lincoln. They were a movement that captured the enthusiasm of a generation and provided an outlet for young men's nascent political fervor. They helped galvanize communities to support a free and democratic way of life. They took a serious approach to keeping elections, state as well as federal, honest and free from corruption. And remembering the time and effort these young men put into their marching drills, I think it entirely possible that the wide awakes provided disciplined and dedicated soldiers who fought for the North in the Civil War. Grinspan makes an excellent case for this in his book. Well, I'd like to thank you for your attention this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the talk and have been enlightened about who the wide awakes were, how they impacted the 1860 election, and how proud we can be of our very own wide awake banner here in Libertyville. I would encourage any of you who have not visited the Anselby Cookhouse and Museum to attend one of our open houses that Jenny mentioned before. There's going to be one after the tree lighting ceremony on November 29th, Friday, until 8 p.m. And we also have 2 open houses on the first 2 Saturdays in December from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. That's December 7th and December 14th. Please come so you can see our magnificent one-of-a-kind banner. And now, before I take any questions, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny for just a minute because she's got a little bit more information for you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. All right, so I just wanted to reiterate what I kind of mentioned at the beginning. If you can come visit the Wide Awakes banner, you'll see the state that it's in. You can't really see it well in the picture that we have here. This is quite an old picture, but it is 164 years old. The seams of it are splitting, so it's starting to detach. It's painted on silk, and the painting is cracking. And so we'll be really kicking this off strongly after the first of the year. But we wanted to make sure while we had Sonia here today and you here learning about the Wide Awakes, that we at least mention that we are looking to get it professionally restored. We have gotten an estimate from the Conservation Center in Chicago. I guess I could tell you how much it's going to be. The estimate to get it conserved and get a new custom archivally sound case is about $25,000 to $30,000. So, the Historical Society has been saving for some time, but we need to raise at least $15,000, if not more, to get moving on the project. So, anyway, we do have our little donation box out. We also have a QR code. You can go to our website and we'll take any donations. And then we encourage you to keep an eye out for when we really start, our big campaign, and to spread the word to your friends as well about the wide awakes and this treasure that we have in the cook home. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sonia. Thank you.
Okay. Well, now I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions and see if there's anything that you have that I didn't cover or something that piqued your interest when I was talking. What can I answer for you? Yeah.
The Democrats have any equivalent for a group that would want to make their candidate?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to repeat the question. The question was, did the Democrats have any similar group that would march like this? And there were other groups that popped up like this for the different candidates, but none of them took off like the Wide Awakes did. Yes.
Clearly, the Wide Awakes supported Lincoln, and which would mean they were anti-slavery. But how important was that anti-slavery issue to them? I mean, was that a clear motivating thing, or was it more, well, let's get our torches out and walk around? You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. And I think that slavery was still a little bit of a, I think I'm not well versed in all the politics, but I think from what I read in Greenspan that not all Republicans were gung-ho about abolition. So I think that some of the groups were very anti-slavery and others were just more Republican. It was, how did he say it? He used the Wide Awakes would mirror the community that they were in and, kind of what they were thinking of. I think of it sort of as a Rorschach test, what you believe is what you see in the Wide Awakes. And I think it wasn't that they just loved marching with, their torches and capes and everything. I think that was a big part of it, but they definitely had their political ideals and they were out there supporting them. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Are there any representations of the Wide Awakes? Is this not Smithsonian or Gettysburg or any major museum?
I'm sure there are in the Smithsonian because that's the author of this book on Wide Awakes. He's the political curator for political acquisitions, and so they have a lot of things there on the Wide Awakes. But well, the thing is that they were just in so many communities that once you start digging, there are a lot of communities all over the place that might have a torch or, I don't know how many capes survived, but banners and things that they used. And people might not even know what they have, but I think a lot of people do. Yeah, Chuck.
Sonia, what do the pictures on our banner represent?
I believe it's a picture of the rally in Chicago. So it's a torchlight parade in, can we go back? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, it is a representation of that march that they were at. And actually, if we get a good light on it, when the estimator was here, you can see that you can actually see them carrying a Libertyville Wide Awakes banner in the painting, which is really, I had never seen that before because of where it's located, it's kind of hard to see the detail, but we looked at it really closely and you can see the banner in the marching.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Do we know the names of the people?
Do we know the names of the people who were in the Wide Awakes? Well, we know Edwin Parkhurst, and there was somebody named Mr. French.
Yeah, and John, we know about a handful. John Hutchinson, Parkhurst, there was a Gridley, French was the captain. that's about it that we know of that we've been able to find reference to, either usually in an obituary or in the French was mentioned often as the captain in the contemporary newspaper articles.
Yeah. Yes.
You had referenced correction of like the newspaper had said town and you said actually would have been township. So is that because township towns weren't like the boundaries there are, I know there's Libertyville township.
Yeah.
And village, so it's confusing because
Mhm.
it clears the name. But were townships the only organized boundaries back then?
Okay, the question is about the usage of the word town to mean township, and Jenny's here to answer that question.
So at least in Illinois, I believe township government went into place in 1850. The village of Libertyville was not incorporated until 1882. So, yeah, that's also why we have American Legion Hall is the town hall. It was the township hall.
And wasn't that part of the Northwest Territory when they divided it? That's how they signified it? And like Ohio,
The way the townships are.
the township.
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
All those Northwest Territory.
Yeah, so we were definitely part of the Northwest Territory when the township governments were, I don't know the dates to compare to 1850 to that. So we were the state of Illinois in 1818. So it wasn't a direct Northwest Territory to township transition, but otherwise I don't know.
Yeah, the township was the early governmental unit. Yeah. So.
Yeah, what's the history of the banner when it came from Chicago to Libertyville? How did it get from Chicago to winding up in the cookhouse?
Okay, so the question is the history of the banner. Would be the provenance, right? You want to talk about that, Jenny?
We know some of it. So we do know that it was in the Cook Library, which is now the Cook Home, as early as 1927. We found reference to the fact that the Libertyville Women's Club had donated a case for it to be held in. We are assuming that it's the same case that it's currently in. We don't know that for sure. We can see a picture of it in the Cook Home in the 1950s. But we think it's been in that case almost 100 years.
We don't know where it was between, say, 19.
I think somebody had it. I think the story is they had it in their barn, right? And it was brought out at special occasions, and it was displayed at at different things. So yeah.
I just wanted to touch on something that someone else had you mentioned while we were taking that break and trying to work out our technical issues about how nobody really talks. You've never heard of the Wide Awakes before, and to me, it's just such an interesting story of how there was a group that formed for a time, for a particular purpose, and then because of the war that came afterwards, a lot of the men served in the war, and then after that, there just wasn't the fervor for the issues, and there was no need for them anymore, I think. So it's really interesting, especially to think about those young men who were part of it in their early formative, political maturing years, and how they, jumped into that. And then by 1889, they were, middle-aged men who were recalling their their glory days with the Wide Awakes or something. I really urge you, if you're interested at all, to read Greenspan's book, because he has some remarkable stories and really delves into the lives of a lot of individuals who were involved. Yeah.
I was thinking as you were talking about the marching at night, that had to have been without electricity and without streetlights, except maybe little candles. That had to have been an amazing thing to see.
Mm-hmm.
All the lights, all the people marching through the town.
Yes.
That had to have been quite a crowd for them.
I think so.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's strong. Yeah.
Okay, so we're all, I don't know if you can hear it online, but we're talking about what the spectacle must have looked like at that time in a world without electricity or very little. To see all these men carrying torchlights and what it would have smelled like, and the fact that for the most part they didn't say anything when they marched. They were disciplined and they marched in their formations, and the captain would call out whatever he would call out to turn left or right or do that zigzag formation. But for the most part, it was just men marching very disciplined with their lights in silence, or with an occasional hurrah, huzzah. I don't know. Yeah, I was thinking the other day, if I could go back in time, that's one of the things that I would love to see, would be a wide awake torchlight parade. Yes, sir.
There's been many books written about Lincoln, and so I've read some of them, but do we have any speeches or anything that Lincoln said himself about the wide awakes? And did you ever make any comments about the wide awakes?
Okay. The question is, did Lincoln make any comments or speeches about the wide awakes? And the only thing that I found was his interaction with them in Springfield and that rally in August of 1860, when there was a big rally in Springfield and they marched by his home and begged him to come out, and so he eventually did. But I think back then, from what I understand, political campaigning was not done by the candidates themselves. They left it to other people. So I think that, not that he wanted to distance himself from them at that point, but I think he just let them do their thing. That's my impression.
It's amazing, and it just survives. Seems like the history almost is lost, and maybe we have this much.
I know, it is amazing that we have this much, and it's part of our fundraising campaign. We kind of thought about the interesting intersection of this book, and things are becoming more and more. Maybe the wide awakes will become more and more well known. Maybe Ken Burns will do a documentary on them. Who knows? But at the same time, we have this banner that's deteriorating. That's an actual physical part of that of that moment in time. John Greenspan would be better for that. We have another question.
As I understand it, Lincoln faced a very tough re-election campaign in 1864.
Right.
Did the wide awakes, now a lot of them would have been in the service,
Mm-hmm.
but did the wide awakes do anything there? Was there another group similar to them?
No.
Importantly? No.
Not that I know of. I think you're, the question was about, did the wide awakes participate in the election of 1864? And to my knowledge, no. And I think it was because these young men were all off fighting or involved in the war in some way. Yeah. Oh, yes, another.
The Civil War was so gruesome too, that you said we didn't hear much about them later. Maybe they just were so overwhelmed they didn't think about much after that, after their experience with the wire.
Yeah. The comment about the Civil, I'm repeating this for our people at home in case you didn't hear it. The comment that the Civil War was so horrible that maybe people didn't talk about it, and that's possible. It might have been something that they just wanted to leave in the past. Although some of them, like Edwin Parkhurst, the gentleman who talked about it all the time, so much that was in his obituary in 27. I think for some people it might have just been that glory day thing. Oh, remember when we did this thing? But it was 160 years ago, and history moves on, and it was it was a year. It was less than a year that they were big. They just wanted to get Lincoln elected, and they did their duty. They did it. Do I have any other questions? Good night, everybody.